recruitID 2023, the Institute of Design. So for those of you that don't know, the Institute of Design, here we look at the world in new ways to create change, the change we hope to see in the world. You know, since our founding by Bauhaus immigrant Laszlo Moholy-Nagy in 1937, our goal has been to turn design into a powerful tool that anyone can use. Our graduates use design to transform the systems that shape our lives, from cities, education and finance, to food, healthcare, and technology. Today, the Institute of Design is the only US design school devoted completely to graduate students, and one of the first to offer a PhD in design. We unite science and rigor with creativity and rapid iteration, and we're pioneers in applying design in the real world. Here, both learners and leaders observe systems in order to envision the new worlds they can build from them. If you're interested in our grad program, please reach out to our deadline for the spring admission, which is October 27th. And today we're really happy to be talking about happiness at work with Dr. Tracy Brower. This event is a part of our annual recruitID event. It's an important part of preparation and just understanding the nature of what we do day in and day out as designers, again, working to make that difference in the world. So let me introduce Dr. Tracy Brower. She is a PhD sociologist studying work-life fulfillment and happiness. She's the author of The Secrets to Happiness at Work and Bring Work to Life. She is the vice president of Workplace Insights for Steelcase and a senior contributor to Forbes and Fast Company. Her work has been translated into 19 languages, and you can find her at tracybrower.com, LinkedIn, or any of the usual social channels. With that, let me introduce Dr. Brower. You've got your presentation. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm going to pull up my presentation. I'm really, really looking forward to our conversation. This is one of my favorite topics, and I absolutely think that we are at such an important and interesting crossroads. So really, really looking forward to our dialogue. I'm going to give you a very short foundation, and then we'll have lots of time for dialogue and discussion and plenty of questions and discussion together. So let me just make sure I'm flipping here. One of the things I think is so great is when we express our talents, when we absolutely are able to make that contribution based on our talents, that is a very big part of happiness. So that's one of the things that I like to think of as a starting point is when we are able to be part of work that is meaningful to us, it absolutely is part of a positive, fulfilled, more substantial life experience. But let's talk about that, because not all work is intrinsically rewarding, and not every moment of work is bonbons and butterflies. So we can be real about that as well. Work can absolutely be a primary source of happiness. I'm worried about the narrative today. You know, the narrative is work is a grind, work is a salt mine, do as little work as you possibly can in order to be happy. But actually, we all have an instinct to matter, and we crave the opportunity to make a contribution. And work is a really important part of life. It's a way that we express our talents, that we express our capabilities, that we make a contribution to our community and to our teammates. And so while work doesn't have to be the only source of happiness, certainly, it absolutely can be an important sense of happiness and source of happiness. So let's talk a little bit more about what that means. First of all, I like to start a little bit in the world of happiness in general and just talk about some myths of happiness that are really, really part of our Western culture. First of all, we have a myth of constancy. We think if we're doing it right, we should always be happy. And in reality, happiness absolutely ebbs and flows. There'll be portions of our life or life stages that are more stressful and some that are less stressful. We'll have tasks that we love and tasks that are not our favorite. And so it's absolutely fair that happiness can ebb and flow. And even within that, we can have an overall sense of joy and contentment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Another myth is the myth of choice. We tend to think that if we choose well, we shall be happy. If we choose the right job, if we choose the right place to live, if we choose the right partner, you fill in the blank, we shall be happy. But in reality, every choice we make is a set of circumstances. There'll be things we adore about our partner and a couple things that might be a little annoying if we're honest. There'll be things that we love about a job, but some things that aren't our favorite. And so I think it's good to be real about our choice making, that we want to choose as much as possible jobs that offer us more of what we love and less of what we don't. Think about kind of a classic Venn diagram, but know that every set of choices is also a set of circumstances. And the other thing that I think is so important is this myth of the silver platter. Sometimes we think, when I get through this project, when I get through this tough exam, when I get through this tough part of my life, when I get through this challenge, then I shall be happy. And that is sort of like waiting for all the conditions to come at us on a silver platter. We take off the silver platter top and hear the ding, and then we will be happy. In reality, we can absolutely create the conditions for happiness, empower ourselves, embrace our sense of agency in terms of creating the conditions for happiness. I'll talk more about how to do that, but the takeaway message here is toward empowerment and really knowing that we can have an influence on our life and our work and our happiness. Another critical thing to know is the happiness paradox. We tend to chase happiness. We talk about happiness. We talk about the importance of happiness. We talk about how to be happy all the time. We've already talked about the myth of constancy. Statistically, though, when you chase happiness for its own sake, you are less likely to be happy. That is true statistically. That is for two reasons. One, if you're chasing something, it reminds you that you don't have enough today. It reminds you of what you don't have rather than being grateful for what you have. The other thing that tends to happen when we chase happiness for its own sake is we tend to be focused on ourselves. And that's negatively correlated with happiness. Positively correlated with happiness is the opportunity to focus on others, contribute to the community, and really think about how we're focusing on helping others. Generosity, gratitude are both significantly correlated with happiness. So that's something to know as well. Instead of chasing happiness for its own sake, we can pursue the conditions that are more likely to create happiness in our lives and our work. And I will talk about what those are. All right. What does it mean to be happy at work? It is a nuanced experience that I think is important, right? It's not all bonbons and butterflies. We're not going to wake up every morning and jump out of bed and say, oh, I can hear the, birds singing and the moment has come for me to work. That is unrealistic for sure. But when we're happy at work, we tend to feel a high level of dedication. Like we get committed to our work. We want to give our best. We're willing to go above and beyond. We feel that sense of dedication, not for every single task, of course, but overall for the contribution we're making. We also tend to get immersed when we're rewarded by our work. This is that moment when you're so involved in what you're doing, and all of a sudden you look at your clock and you're like, where did the time go? That is also related to the experience of flow, which we can talk more about later if we want to. But immersion tends to be part of an experience of happiness at work. Vigor is cool as well. This is a two-way street, right? When we are more fulfilled by our work, we tend to feel energized by it, and we tend to want to put energy into it. And then happiness at work often has an element of mattering. Like you feel like it makes a difference what you're doing. You may not be solving world peace or world hunger, but you feel like the small thing that you do matters to others in your organization, to end users. It matters in terms of the way that you're influencing design in the world and the experience that we have of life and work. So those are some of the things to think about. You won't have all these every minute of every day, of course, but this is different than just sort of feeling a level of sort of toxic positivity, if you will. These are some of the substantive elements. This is about the moment when a lot of people say, yeah, Tracy, but this feels pretty fluffy. Really, happiness? Is that what we should be focusing on? Actually, there is an incredible amount of research on happiness and joy, engagement, well-being. And what we find is that when people are happier, they tend to have better physical health. That's good for people, obviously. It's also good for benefits costs for organizations. We tend to set bigger goals and be more likely to meet them. We tend to perform better when we're happier. We tend to be more likely to stick with an organization. And we know retention is something that organizations want. And interestingly, happiness has a spillover effect. This is really cool. If you're working around others who are engaged or productive, you will tend to pick up on that engagement and productivity. The other element of spillover is that if you're happy at work, you tend to be happier outside of work. That's not rocket science. You've probably heard of that before. But the opposite is also true. When you're happier outside of work, you tend to perceive greater happiness inside of work. That is a concept called dimensionality, and we can talk more about that if you'd like. This also operates at the country level. When countries' citizens are happier, they tend to have greater GDP, greater educational attainment, and better physical health. So happiness matters, not just because it feels good, but also because it's good for us as individuals, teams, organizations, and even countries. So it's a very good and worthwhile discussion for us to have. All right, so how do we create joy in our work? And this is something we can dig into in questions and in follow-up information to the extent that you want. But one of the things that's absolutely critical is a sense of purpose. This doesn't have to be giant world-changing things that we're doing. This can be dreaming small. This can be waking up every morning and doing the small thing that you do well that matters to other people. And we will talk a little bit later in the questions about, the intrinsic value of work and the fulfilling nature of work. Again, not every task is intrinsically fulfilling. However, the overall experience of making that contribution, especially when it relates to purpose, is absolutely correlated with happiness. The small thing that you do as you see it laddering up to things that absolutely make a difference for others. Another really critical way that you can create the conditions for happiness is through connections. Whether we are introverts or extroverts, we have an absolute need to feel connected with other people. And work is a fundamental way that we feel that connection. You don't have to be BFFs with everybody that you work with, but that feeling of other people paying attention, the feeling of being seen, the feeling that you are involved in a meaningful pursuit with others, the sense of identity that you get from working on something with others is significantly correlated with happiness. So an intentional focus on creating meaningful relationships, an intentional focus on creating constructive relationships with colleagues, even if that means having a really, really great disagreement and coming into conflict because you see things differently. Doing that in constructive ways is absolutely part and parcel of meaningful work. Another element that drives joy at work is gratitude. This is very significantly correlated with happiness. When you're intentional about what you appreciate, when you're intentional, you wake up in the morning and you think about what you're grateful for, you go to bed at night, think about what you're grateful for, those create the conditions for happiness. And this tends to be most acute when you are grateful for capabilities or conditions or people. It's usually less impactful when you're grateful for things, although gratitude is good no matter what. Another thing that contributes to the conditions for happiness is performance. Thriving has elements in the research. Thriving has elements of performing really, really well. Oh, I just had my personal best on my sprint time, or I just performed brilliantly on this great new design challenge. Thriving also has elements of what you're developing next and how you're going for something next. So when you're able to put yourself into situations at work where you're performing well, you're committed, you're making a great effort, you're rolling up your sleeves, that performance is correlated with esteem and happiness. And stretch is the other part of that. This is one thing we don't always talk a lot about. But when you're struggling, when you're sweating, that can be a really positive element toward happiness. There's a Goldilocks rule here. You don't want to be just sitting around and not having anything to challenge you. That can be depressing and disheartening. On the other side of the continuum, you don't want to be stressed out to the extreme. That's also depressing and disheartening. But when you have a just right amount of challenge, when you have a cool new thing to learn or go after or put your heart into with your team, that is absolutely a great way to create the conditions for happiness. So we can dig into any of these as much as you'd like, and there's great follow-up we can send you on all of this. But these are 5 of kind of the primary conditions that drive happiness. And let me just give you one bonus list, and then we'll come to our time for dialogue and questions. This is, ironically, all of these have been demonstrated through research in terms of their impact on happiness. So eat your vegetables. I know this is like the health portion of the conversation. There's a theory that if you have more carotenoids circulating through your blood, it contributes to your sense of happiness. Pets are great for happiness. If you're a weekend napper, keep doing that. That's good for happiness. Cold exposure tends to activate your vagus nerve and reduce stress and activate your vagus system, your system for circulation. So all of these actually have some evidence toward happiness. And you can pick your poison here in terms of what you like. And again, we can dig into this if you would like to. So the best way to predict the future is to create it. And we can absolutely create the conditions for happiness in work and in life. And work can be a wonderful source of joy. So this is our moment for a bright future. Things have been upside down and inside out. And what better way to have innovation and to design a future that we're really happy about? So reach out to me. We will have an opportunity right now. But if you want to have a follow-up dialogue or share any of your additional thoughts, I would love that. You can reach out to me in lots of different ways. So with that, I am going to turn it back to Peter and engage with Peter and Lauren, and look forward to our conversation.
Tracy, thank you so much for that. It was a great setup, and I probably should have done a better job explaining the context of today's presentation. I was so excited to have you speak about happiness at work that I rushed through a lot. We really want this to be a dialogue. We want it to be a dialogue. Lauren Johnson is here representing the ID students to get their perspective. And we've got a lot of alumni and others interested, and we want your questions. Down at the bottom of Zoom, there's a Q&A button. Please use that to put your questions in basically Zoom, and we'll get to those and basically facilitate that conversation. So again, Tracy, thank you for sharing that. Lauren, do you have some questions for Tracy?
Yes, I do. Hi, Tracy. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I read your book and took away a lot of really great principles. I think a lot of your perspectives are really refreshing, with some common beliefs in the workplace. So one section that stood out to me in your book is called "It's Not About Balance." And I think you share a really important point when you say we deserve more than just balance. We deserve life fulfillment, work-life fulfillment, harmony, and satisfaction. And for me as a master's student, and we're all going to be entering the workforce and soon, I love this section because I've always heard that balance, you should try to achieve balance. And if you do, it means your life's under control. So I would love if you could talk more to that, especially for some people who maybe haven't read your book yet, and how we can strive for work-life satisfaction over trying to achieve balance.
Oh, I love this question so much. I just feel like we've gotten into this dialogue about balance, which suggests that there's this trade-off between work and life, and you can't have both and you can't have it all. In fact, I'm a really big fan of the mantra, you can have it all. You may not just be able to have it all at once. So, like the thing about work is it's an important part of a full life. Like it's not choosing between the two. We can have both. And life stage is an important way to think about this as well. Like depending on your life stage, early life stage, mid life stage, later life stage, you may want to put more or less into your work and prioritize your work in different kinds of ways. The problem with that trade-off thinking is that we don't think we can have it all. And I think one of the things that's important is that we don't consider a single right answer. I think that's part of the challenge in the narrative about work-life balance, is that there's a single right answer, right? And you have to do it in one way or the other. And then we tend to be judgy about how we're going about work life. And we think, oh, that person has it right, and I'm just failing over here. We may want, for example, to have more porous boundaries. Like I wake up in the morning and work, and then I get the kids ready, or I go to school, or I go to work, and then I come back later and turn on. I prefer a porous boundary. You may prefer a boundary that's a little bit brighter, right? Like brighter line between the two. I start at this time, I end at this time, and I don't do work outside of those hours. I think that's an example of where we can think about how our own right answer may be different than the narrative. And the idea that work is part of a full life. And we absolutely can find happiness within an experience of work as well as outside of an experience of work.
I love that. Thank you very much. And I think that's really true, especially for people who, yeah, we kind of always hear that, how do we achieve balance, and what does that look like? And I think for me, that was like, oh, how do I achieve work-life satisfaction and fulfillment? And that might look different from the next person.
Yeah.
I have one more question just from my readings in the book. Something else that I feel like really stood out to me was, you talk about how saying yes is the fastest way to developing our talents and cultivating joy. And I think this is another interesting topic because, and you mentioned this, it's good to have boundaries. It's good to know when to say no. But sometimes if we say no to everything, we would miss out on really pivotal life experiences. And I reflected on my own, and I had that sentiment. If I said no to certain things, I would have missed out on some really great moments. So I would love if again, you could kind of talk more to that, and how can we learn to trust ourselves in deciding what to say yes to? And also, how can we avoid burnout, by saying yes to the right things?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this is a good one. This is part of the self-care narrative, right? The self-care narrative says, in order to avoid burnout, you need to take a bath once a week and have a bath bomb and say no to as much as you possibly can, right? Unfortunately, that can shut us down from really great experiences. And so that's why I talk about saying yes to the things that energize us and being really in touch with how we get energized. There is beautiful research on time and our perception of time. And actually, when you're doing things that energize you, you perceive you have more time. So saying no to everything isn't necessarily the right answer, right? Like if I absolutely love, I don't know, dogs and pets, and I'm energized by that, and I have an opportunity to volunteer at the local shelter, that might be actually a great idea to add to my plate on a weekend, for example, because it will give me the perception of more time because it's rewarding to me. And so the other thing about saying yes is that we get to develop our skills and our capabilities. And I love your language about trusting ourselves. A lot of times, because of the relevance of stretch to happiness, we're really smart to reach out before we're 100% ready. There's a nice rule of 70% that says if you're 70% ready for the next thing, go for it, because you'll get into the role and you'll have the opportunity to learn and stretch and challenge yourself. Sometimes people invite us into new roles or new development opportunities, and we may not think we're totally ready, but they're seeing something about us that we may not feel as confident about. In fact, interestingly, the concept of morale is about motivation, but it's also about confidence and a belief in the future. And so when we're saying yes, it's like a vote for ourselves. It's a vote for our potential. It's a vote for the people that we know will support us in that effort. And I like the idea of maintaining our boundaries, being careful about saying no when we need to say no. We're not going to be silly about, saying yes to things that don't energize us. But when we have that next stretch opportunity, when we have that opportunity to say yes to something that energizes us, that can actually be really good for self-care, and also really good for conditions where we're not burned out and bummed out and not doing things that we don't love.
I love that. Thank you. I love that you related that to self-care, saying yes to things. And prioritizing what means the most to us. So thank you very much. Again, anybody who hasn't read her book yet, it's really great for how to just navigate all these different questions. And Peter, I will turn the time back over to you.
Right.
Thanks, Lonnie.
And we have fantastic questions that we're going to get to in just a moment. I just wanted to ask one about this concept of choosing. You say we can choose joy, but often we don't because we fear that responsibility that comes with it. What advice do you have to overcome that fear of being responsible for our joy?
Yeah, this is such an existential as well as pragmatic question. Like, optimism is fundamentally hope. It's not just about hope, it's also about responsibility, right? Like, if we're optimistic, it says that we think there could be something better and therefore we have some responsibility for it. And so I feel like we absolutely need to empower ourselves to make those choices, not just for ourselves, but for other people. And this has to do also, I think, with confidence. When we know that we have the ability to do something, and when we have a growth mindset, that's a big deal toward making great choices and empowering ourselves. We don't have to have all the answers, but if we care enough about something to make a choice toward that thing, we know we can figure it out. We know we can develop our capabilities. We know that we can gather people around us who can help us. That growth mindset suggests that our capabilities aren't static. We can always grow. We can always get better. We can always thrive toward more. And so I think that's the thing to keep in mind when we're making choices. I think that's the thing to keep in mind when we're staying optimistic, is believing in our own capabilities and then believing that we can learn, we can grow, and believing in the capabilities of others around us, whom we can rely on and look for support from.
Wonderful. As a follow-up to that, the action of choosing seems to imply intent or purpose. What do you see as a solid foundation for guiding the choices that will lead to happiness?
Yeah, I mean, I think a really solid foundation is thinking about your own values, first of all, and your own true north. Like, when you have a really clear sense of your values and a really clear sense of kind of your purpose and vision, right? Like, what do you kind of think your gift to the world is? Again, it doesn't have to be some big thing. It can just be the thing that you do well. So use your vision about your future and your values about yourself as guides. I think also when we use as a guide how we contribute to others, we absolutely know that when we're focused on others and focused on the contribution we can make, that is not only correlated with happiness, it's also correlated with making a meaningful difference in the world. And I think those are really good sort of guardrails. And then I think the other guideline, in addition to vision and values and how you can make a contribution, is your own sense of talent and capability, right? Like, what's the thing that you do uniquely well? And what's the thing that you can bring to the world? There's brilliant new research on pride, and there are two different kinds of pride. One is more intrinsic, like you feel pride when you do something well, and you actually have a greater sense of happiness when you've worked harder for something. The second kind of pride is a more superficial sense of pride that you get just from lots of visibility, right? And sometimes social media can guide us toward the second, and that tends to be empty calories. Like, okay, I'm getting a lot of visibility, but it might be a humble brag, or it might be all about kind of the superficial thing that I'm putting forward. So the other thing to think about as we're making choices is, how can we make substantive contribution where we're putting ourselves forward in a meaningful way, rather than just sort of getting visibility and getting out there and kind of being online all the time.
Yeah, wonderful. We've got so many great questions from our attendees that I'm going to switch over. Jessica Bogart is asking, what do you see the role of managers and leaders helping to create the conditions of happiness? And how can we help managers get on board if they don't see this as a priority?
Oh my gosh, this is like the question of the hour. I think we're in the middle of this, what I think of as the great sift in terms of managers and leaders. As we've gone through really hard times, the great leaders who motivate us, who can lead by objectives, who can lead by outcomes, are the ones who have kind of risen to the fore, and they become models for how we behave. The other thing that is true is that managers have an incredible impact on mental health. I did an article on this in Forbes not too long ago that 69% of people say that their manager or their leader has a greater impact on their mental health than their doctor or their therapist, and on par with their partner. Like, no pressure, right? But that's good news because of the positive impact that managers can have. So I think, first of all, we can influence managers to understand how important this is by pointing to the business benefits. I did an article in Forbes on business benefits of happiness. We can send that to you as a follow-up, or you can Google it really easily. But there's incredible business case and proof statement for how happiness contributes to the things that I talked about at the outset. The other thing that managers can do is give people a sense of purpose, remind them of how their work matters. Even if you're, I don't know, putting a widget on a part in an assembly line, that goes into a product that has an effect on real human beings. And so when you remind people of the purpose that we share and the line of sight toward how it matters, their piece of it toward the big picture, that is helpful. Another thing that's really helpful for people is leaders and managers who are present, accessible, and predictable. Statistically, when leaders are more present and accessible, that contributes to happiness and well-being. When leaders are predictable, that actually also contributes to those elements. And a third thing that leaders can do is help people to bond with each other on the team when we have those connections. That might look like team building. You know, team building is great. Statistically, we actually bond more powerfully over task than over social stuff. So the social stuff is super important. We can talk more about that. But also, when we put people together on a project, when we ask people to roll up sleeves together, when we remind people of common goals, that helps solidify connections, and it helps solidify networks and opportunities for performing together. So those are three things that leaders can do, is that sense of purpose, that sense of accessibility and predictability and presence, and then thirdly, connecting people with others.
Wonderful. Well, following up on that thought, Robbie King has a question. Teamwork is so much of what we're doing, not only at ID, but just the nature of work. We're dealing with complex challenges. And he's asking, when navigating difficult team dynamics, how can you maintain happiness kind of in the middle of that stressful project?
Yeah, this is, I have such a soapbox about this discussion, because I think sometimes we think ideal teams aren't going to have a lot of conflict, but a boat that isn't going anywhere doesn't make any waves, right? I like that little mantra. So conflict is actually a really good thing. And I think what worries me is that sometimes we can be so conflict averse that we can't get things done, or so conflict averse that we don't innovate. And so I think we can create cultures where it's okay to disagree with each other in a constructive way. One of the things I always like to do in team meetings is say, does anybody see that differently? You know how a lot of times we'll say, does everybody agree? And it's just a little twist in our phrasing, right? Does anybody see that differently? When we ask people in the room who represent diversity how they might see it differently, when we invite people into the dialogue who may have been a little more quiet, when somebody brings up a dissenting point of view and we listen and ask questions and lean into that, I think that's a big deal. And when we respect people kind of at a fundamental level, and then when we're able to reinforce the values of compromise together, all of those are helpful. I think the other thing that we can do, especially in design expertise, is design is about empathy for the user experience. And it's about, how we think about incorporating that. And so when we are empathetic toward others in the process, and when we remind ourselves that innovation comes from the edges and from sources of constructive disagreement, those are also really good ways to reinforce the benefit of conflict and constructive disagreement. Wonderful.
Well, you just raised the concept of empathy, and there are a couple questions regarding just the nature of work now, that it is either a hybrid situation or remote. Could you talk, and this is a question from Meghna Prakash, just former student at the Institute of Design. Could you talk about the elements of connection given our hybrid world of work now, and how does one create meaningful connections in this new way of working together?
Oh my gosh, I love this question. It is also the question of the hour, right? I have to tell you, there's a very, very fun PhD study that was done, and it looked at, it asked people to collaborate in an experimental situation across a campus, like a corporate campus, across the nation and across the globe. And they tracked people's follow-up, follow through, and task completion, and found that the closer people were, the more likely they were to do better with task completion, follow up, and follow through. So when they were working across the campus, they were better with each other than when they were working across the globe. The twist on the experiment is that they were all sitting next to each other in conference rooms that they didn't realize. And so the takeaway message is that proximity can be both real and perceived. So I think we have this wonderful opportunity to create proximity as much as possible, get together face to face, be IRL, in real life together, right? Sometimes that's not possible. So the other ways that we can create proximity are to keep cameras on as much as possible. We get, cues from each other non-verbally, not perfectly on camera, but better than off camera, to really stay in touch with each other. Like the idea of frequency of communication is really important especially when we're hybrid or when we're remote, we're staying in touch. Another thing we can do to create that sense of proximity is to value some of the superficial connections. Statistically, superficial connections are also correlated with happiness. So, like if we're good business people, we're good organizational citizens, and we get right to the task when we get together. Sometimes we're missing out. Sometimes that chit chat at the beginning is actually a big thing, right? I learn about you. I learn about, what kind of pet you have. I learned what the weather is in your region. And those ironically contribute to relationships. And when we have stronger relationships, we also tend to do better in terms of our follow-up, follow-through, and task completion. So it's an investment. So that idea of frequency, the other thing that is important in terms of creating that sense of proximity is having the opportunity to work on meaningful work together. So again, when we take initiative, when we volunteer to solve a problem, when we volunteer to help a colleague, when we volunteer to get involved in the project, those are really great ways to have substantive interaction that build both relationships and our sense of proximity.
Wonderful. Ashlyn Spildy asks if you're in a workplace with a culture of unhappiness, are there certain steps that you can take to manage your own happiness when leaving the company, or when leaving the company is not an option? So you're in this unhappy place and you're seeking happiness. What can you do about that?
Yeah, wow, this is such a big deal, right? Because you can't always choose to leave. And we can talk about when and if you choose to leave later on. But I think one of the things to do is to remember your influence on others. Sociologically speaking, the number one way we learn is through watching other people, listening to other people, experiencing other people. So how you show up has a huge influence. So never underestimate your own influence. You're not going to show up like Pollyanna every day, dancing and singing down the corridor, but you can show up in a constructive way. That's one. Another thing I think we can do is show gratitude and recognition toward our colleagues, even in the tiniest way. Even in the meeting, we go, oh, that was a great question. Let me speak to that. Or, oh, I had that idea too. I'm so glad you raised it, right? Even simple things where we're recognizing, validating, showing gratitude toward others are a big deal. I think the other thing, and this is you're going to think this is a little sideways, but this gets to the idea that when you're happier outside of work, you tend to be happier inside of work. So if your work experience is not positive for you, find other things that feed you, and that will contribute to this overall sense of joy and contentment. And it will actually help you to feel better perspective and better sense of joy within your work. The other thing, I just wrote an article of what you can learn from annoying or difficult coworkers. I just did one of those for Fast Company. So that's the other thing, right? Like you might be surrounded by turkeys, but you know, maybe there are ways that you can kind of bring something from that experience. It's kind of what not to wear, right? Like you can kind of learn what are the things that are really tough and how can you bring something better yourself.
Wonderful. So Michael George asks, or he's interested in the need for passion in our work, that some people do not feel this is needed, that work is primarily just to support life outside of work, external goals. Others feel that passion through their work is important. And you know, he left his career to attend grad school. And so that's where he's coming from. What's your perspective on the need to be passionate about the work that you're doing, whether it's at a project or company level versus just surviving work to live outside of it?
Yeah, this is super fair. I'm so glad you asked this question. Really interesting research on the different sources of joy that we have. Some people get joy from their work because they're doing good work every day and they're putting, you know, food on the table and they're paying their mortgage and they're supporting their family or their partner. All good. If that's how you think about joy and passion, that's totally cool. And I think we need to be careful not to be judgy about that. Other people, so that's kind of the job level of satisfaction. The other level is career level. Like you feel a deep connection to the profession that you've chosen and you're making a contribution to that. And the third level is kind of a mission basis. Like you're doing something because you feel a personal mission or calling toward that thing. All of those things, I think, make tremendous sense in terms of how you choose to engage. And if you've chosen to leave your work and you're back at grad school, that's your job for now, right? I think the critical thing is to try to do things in your life that energize you and that you feel passionate about. And that might be different for everybody. And certainly work isn't the only source of that passion. Interesting, you tend to be happier if you're more aligned with doing things that energize you and that you enjoy. But not all work is intrinsically joyful. And I love the idea, and Peter, I know you had a question about this too that we were talking about ahead of time. I love the idea of pilots. So for those of you who fly, you need to know the pilot is not flying the plane the whole flight. The pilot is typically actively flying on takeoff and on landing, but it is very uncommon for them not to put the plane on autopilot for part of the flight. I think we can think about that with our work as well. Like there'll be parts of our work where we're going to absolutely give it our all. We're going to commit and go to the nth degree and, oh my gosh, I want to do this brilliantly. And then there are other things that you can just do well enough. Like on my expense reports, I don't need to knock it out of the park. I just got to do an expense report that's accurate and represents integrity, right? In reporting my expenses. So I think we can think about this idea of elements of our job that may be more meaningful or less meaningful. And the last thing I'll say, I love this example. My husband and I were having this conversation. He worked in the automotive industry and he was in a sales role. And he used to sell windows that go into vehicles. And so he would work with squeak and rattle engineers. So he would go to Detroit and he would drive around a track with squeak and rattle engineers sitting in the back of a Ford Taurus, listening for squeaks and rattles of the window. Like not intrinsically sexy work, right? Like you're not jumping out of bed every morning going, oh, squeaks and rattles today. However, the point of him making a contribution, of doing his best, of knowing that his work was necessary in the scheme of things for that role was a really important part of it. So I also think that you can have passion about making a contribution, even if you don't have passion about squeaks and rattles.
Yeah. And I think what you referenced earlier was that I think in our pre-talk, I mentioned that there are tasks in that day-to-day that just feel mundane and just like work. And when I've experienced that, I remembered a Zen koan that said, when peeling potatoes, just peel the potatoes. So that concept, could you just elaborate on that, how that relates to happiness at work in terms of just mindfulness and just trying to get that, you can still do those things well. Does that lead to happiness?
Yes, I love that. Just do those things well. And I think this is back to that idea too of dreaming small, right? Like you can just do the small thing that you do brilliantly. And I think the other thing that's related here is a lot of times we want to grow, especially for Gen Z. We know that's a really high priority: growth, learning, the next thing, right? And when we perform with excellence, and in even the small and mundane things, that will tend to get us noticed to a greater extent. And I think we can be just in the present moment, kind of doing the mundane, but knowing that the mundane is meaningful for somebody. I'm just going to peel the potatoes. It's okay if everything I do isn't, extraordinarily motivating for me, but somebody's going to enjoy the potatoes that I'm peeling. It's like the concept of ikigai, which has to do with the reason you wake up in the morning. And the example of the Japanese grandmother who wakes up in the morning to make soup for her family. Just do the thing that you do. And it's okay if it's just peeling the potatoes. And remind yourself that your contribution matters, even in the mundane tasks of life. We all have them. Oh, one other thing. Happiness is significantly correlated when you have more of the things you love and less of the things you don't. Think of a Venn diagram. You will never have a job that doesn't include peeling potatoes. Everybody's going to have to peel some potatoes, figuratively speaking. So find a job where you do more of the stuff you love and less of the stuff you don't, knowing there will always be a mix.
I'm glad that you've now added peel the potatoes to the lexicon of ID. So that hadn't always been networking. This is a question that's asked by an attendee. What role does power play in happiness? And what do you say to people with limited agency in their workplace?
Oh, this is a big deal, right? I'm a really, really big believer in the both and of agency and structure. So agency, we all have a level of agency, even if we don't have much. And structure is that we also are part of a context. We're part of the conditions that leaders set up, the conditions that organizations set up, the conditions that society sets up. And our experience of life is a combination of those two. So what we don't want to do is give away power and just, kind of be in a victim mentality, like, oh, I can never be happy until all these other things happen. People can take away all your choices, but you still have opportunities toward attitude, toward the way you interact with others, toward the way that you seek to make a contribution. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is one of the very best examples of this kind of thing. However, there are also situations where you have less influence. And I think when you have less influence, you can either choose to have greater influence as much as possible in the ways I just mentioned, toward your attitude, toward the way you interact with others, toward the way you model. And I think it's also a really good idea to think about when you stay and when you go. We were alluding to this a little bit before. And I always like to think about a 2x2. I mean, any good sociologist can make a 2x2 matrix, right? A 2x2 matrix of like, how big is the issue? Small, medium, and large. Like, is it a small thing or is it deeply systemic, right? Embedded in the organization. And then what's your level of influence? High, medium, low. And I think we can make a choice about how we go about our work and whether we stay or go. So if it's a systemic issue, but I've got tons of influence, I might stay in order to make a difference for others, in order to make a difference for that organization. If it's a tiny issue and I have lots of influence, I might also stay, right? We'll get over it. Tomorrow will be different, right? If it's a huge systemic issue and I just don't feel like I can influence it very much, that might be a moment to choose to find a different set of challenges, a different opportunity. So I think we can think about those elements of how big is the issue and how much influence do we have, and then remind ourselves of the level of influence that we have as well.
Wonderful. Daniela Velez asks, how can leaders strike a balance between the need to be high performing and employee happiness?
That's a great one. I am a really big fan of accountability. Like, we don't do any favors for people if we don't hold them accountable. We want to give people space. If they're struggling, we want to be empathetic. We want to give people the opportunity to perform better over time, to develop their skills, to work through the personal thing that they have. And when we hold people accountable, we remind them of their value to the organization. We need you. We need your deliverable. We need your brain in the room. We need your presence. And when we hold people accountable, sending that message of value is actually good for mental health. It's good for them to feel seen. So I think that's part of that balance that managers have, is they can listen, they can ask questions, they can be attuned to employees and kind of check in. They don't have to be social workers. They can offer resources. And I think when they are tuned in and demonstrating empathy through those methods that I mentioned, that goes a long way toward people feeling seen and valued. And I think they can attend to performance and attend to accountability, knowing that that sends a message of value as well.
Wonderful. And I know this next question relates, you've got a strong point of view, not only because of what's in your book, because you also come from Steelcase, and it's increasing given the nature of hybrid work, but how important is physical space to happiness? Not only is it important, this is from Michael George, by the way, what are some of the critical elements of the physical space that companies should prioritize in doing well?
Yeah, I'm a real believer in the value of physical space. I don't think we need to be physically together every single minute, and I absolutely believe hybrid is the future. However, I also think that there's a huge value in us being together. We feel a greater level of connection with each other. We have an easier time developing relationships more deeply and more quickly. We get feedback from others and therefore can improve our performance. We get more visibility and we can develop our careers better, more. Lots of organizations are valuing people no matter where they work and wanting to promote them no matter where they work. But we also have a cognitive bias toward people that we see more, and cognitive bias toward the era of recency, like we're kind of reminded of things when they've happened more recently for us. And I think the other thing is we can learn and grow more effectively when we're in person. So like we're sitting next to a colleague and we're able to kind of like bump elbow and go, hey, did you get this? Or did you understand this? Or did you see that thing? Or hey, how did you handle this customer thing? Or when we're sitting next to a colleague, we overhear how they dealt with a big challenge with a customer and we learn from that. We have coffee with our mentor in the work cafe, and it's just easier to kind of lean in and go, hey, what would you do in this situation? Mm-hmm. So I absolutely believe we can develop meaningful relationships and perform meaningfully when we're at a distance or when we're remote. And I really believe that the physical experience of being together makes a difference. It's really interesting. The human condition and a cognitive bias is that when we have proximity is the #1 determinant of relationships. That's because we just get data about each other. I see you walk in the morning and you seem a little down and I check in with you. Or over time, we get to interact on both task and relationship. And the other thing about proximity is that when we're more familiar, we tend to be more accepting. This is true of food, it's true of music, it's true of art. When we're exposed to things more, we tend to be more accepting of them. And that happens with human beings. Like I see you more and I start to get you, quote unquote, and that tends to drive greater levels of acceptance. And empathy is driven by relationships and exposure to each other as well. When I'm exposed to you, I have an easier time empathizing with, how might you be thinking and feeling right now? So I think there's definitely a place for face-to-face human connection that will never go away.
Wonderful. In my experience, I know I've experienced more happiness when I feel a sense of purpose. I have the rudder. It feels like I have a strong, grasp on a rudder headed somewhere. And Young In asks, what steps do you recommend to find our own purpose? That getting on the right path. We talk often about the career journey. And how does that unfold? How can you start with purpose if you're lacking it right now?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I've written a few articles on purpose that would be good. You could just Google purpose, Brower, Forbes, and find some of those. But one of the things I really like to think about is, what did you love to do when you were a kid? Like, what did you just love to do? What energized you? You played in the woods, you went to the beach, you made forts in the living room, right? Whatever you did, what did you love to do when you were a kid? Is one way to start to get at it. Another is, what are you most energized by? What do you lose time doing? What is it that you're doing and you're like, you look up later and go, oh my gosh, where did the time go, right? That tells you a little bit about what energizes you today. Another way to think about purpose is to think about, what do you get feedback on? Like, what do people say? Oh, that was amazing what you just did. Or, wow, you made a really big difference to me. Or, oh, that was the coolest idea. I never would have thought of that. Think about what kind of feedback you're getting from others. And then think about those things in relationship to the contribution that you can make. So we're always happier, not just when we're pursuing the thing that we love, but when we're pursuing the thing that we love that matters to others. So also kind of be aware of, in your community, what is that need? In your community, what are the ways that your unique capabilities match up with the unique needs that you care about? And I think those are ways to start to ferret out your purpose, to clarify your purpose, to articulate your purpose. And then I am just a huge fan of taking action. In fact, when we take action, that is correlated with greater levels of well-being. Like, if we're kind of ruminating and not sure and not sure and not sure, it can actually be really helpful to just try it. It's kind of like if you're explaining to somebody how to play a card game. You know how you're explaining and you're explaining, and then at some point somebody goes, let's just start playing, and it'll become more clear. And so I think another way to find your purpose is to do a thing and then figure out what you'd like to do next, and then kind of watch for the thing that looks interesting after that, and sort of take those steps. And through the action, you'll learn, what do you love? What do you love more? What do you love less? And how do you kind of tweak that journey along the way? I think you don't always have to have a master plan for everything you're going to do for the next 50 years. You can try it and then tweak and then try and then move forward. And those are really meaningful ways to also pursue your purpose.
Right. I love that, in terms of just, it's like prototyping, learning, you're basically doing something, getting some feedback. Samantha Chandra has a question about, and you've talked about this, that maybe you're in an environment that's not appropriate, and you want to make a change. She wants to know, how do we know that leaving is actually a productive move that we do for our careers and our mental health, and not just an act of quitting, which feels more like failure, especially to highly motivated students here at ID. They seek meaning, they seek purpose, they want to make a difference, and I think feeling like a failure is probably the worst thing that they could feel. So when is that a good move? And what are some of the conditions or things to look out for?
Yeah, I've written on this. In fact, I just wrote an article for Newsweek that was like, why you might regret your job change or something. I've written on it in a few different places. That's one that's recent. I think one of the things you can really be clear about is, are you making a grass is greener choice, or are you making a choice because there's something systemically that you're not happy about? So it's always better to go towards something than just to get away from something. I think that's one. I think another is, you can think about what you might miss in your current experience, and think about how big a deal that would be to you to be missing it. Think about the connections that you've got and the network that you've got, whether you'll be significantly missing your people who are a really big part of happiness in a role, or whether you'll be thinking about, finding a new set of people. Of the large number of people who have changed careers, 61% of people have buyer's remorse, and they wish that they had stayed longer with their current role. So I think another thing to consider is, again, back to, is it a systemic issue that you have influence on or not? Those are some of the ideas and criteria for some of that choice making. Ultimately, I think it's about, do you see greater potential in where you're going than in where you are? And given the investment you've made in your current culture, might you find other things within that organization or not? And so those are some of the things I think we can consider.
Wonderful. Now we're coming up on time, but there's one final question here that I think is wonderful. What excites you about the future of work? There's plenty. I didn't ask any AI questions. Like we're all doomed to be unemployed because of AI. But what excites you about the future of work?
Yeah, actually, I think AI could be interesting, right? Like it takes over the things we don't love to do, and we get to do more of what we do love to do. Although there's lots of cautions. I've got about 3 articles out there on AI and the future of work. Here's what excites me about the future of work. We are thinking about it so consciously. Things are upside down and inside out. And when things are so unsettled, it gives us an opportunity to create more meaning, to make it better, to find a way that work becomes more rewarding and fulfilling as part of a full life. So that's what I think is pretty cool about the future of work, is that we're thinking about it, talking about it, and so conscious, not just about where, when, and how we work, but about why we work and with whom and for whom we can find the most fulfillment.
Well, that is a wonderful thing to end on. It's always happiness of work. There we go. That's the only way for it to show up. Tracy, I want to thank you for just spending the morning talking about a very important topic, not only about, again, feeling productive, but being able to have that true joy in what we're doing. And I see that in the students here at the Institute of Design. Lauren, do you have anything to add or close on?
No, this was great. I think a lot of important points were hit, and there's some great principles that were shared that I think will be helpful for us as we are planning our lives and even just going about our lives as students and finding fulfillment in this role, in this stage of life as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay. I encourage you all to read The Secrets of Happiness at Work. Dr. Tracy Brower, thank you so much for being a part of recruitID, the Institute of Design. Thank you.
Thank you so much.